Human history is made by human action. So we're making our own history, but we're not making it in the way we think we are. According to Adam Smith, it's our economic systems that shape the way human history develops, and they shape it in ways we don't anticipate. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations is a study of economics as basically the driving force in human society. And in particular, he shows how crucial developments in human history are the unanticipated consequences of economic struggles, of economic situations where people with their own nasty self-interested motives were working against each other and ended up producing a good situation. One of the most powerful examples of that is the development of free representative government in the Western world. In Europe, after the fall of the Roman Empire, really what you had were powerful barons or lords who controlled a lot of land. And they lived off the resources they got from those lands. They had nothing else to do with those resources, though. They have food, timber, whatever, it's just going to waste otherwise. What they do with it is they use it to feed and support many, many people who live on their lands. And those people, in return for the support that they get from the Lord, owe him things. They especially owe him military service. And so the Lord ends up becoming like a kind of a mini king in this environment, who is the one responsible for distributing justice, settling disputes and so on, and also has control over pretty much everything. He can tell you who your children can marry. He can deal with your property. He can do pretty much whatever he wants. In that situation, some barons grew to great power and they became, kings. The king is officially the king of, the whole kingdom of France or whatever, but the king has no magic power that suddenly lets him rule there. Those barons are quite powerful. And so there's an ongoing struggle between those two people to see just who's going to control things. In that context, another thing happens. And that is that those countrysides, farms and whatever else, forests, they're going to be better served if people develop some tools. And so in addition to people who do agricultural work, people do various trades and so on. The tradesmen generally end up congregating in towns. And so towns become the center for industry, basically. And the countryside becomes the source for the raw materials that go to that. The tradespeople supply valuable manufactured goods like, hoes or whatever else, plows, to the people who have to work in the country. And the people in the country bring the raw materials to the people in the city who can then use them to make their goods, sell them, make a profit, build a life, etc. So what the kings did is they basically allied with the people in the towns and started granting privileges to the people in the towns, namely that they could choose for themselves who their children were going to marry, and they could hand their property down to their children after they died, and they could have their own courts to settle matters of justice rather than turning to the baron who controlled that larger area. And so the kings, by granting rights to the towns, started to establish their own power base. And so the opposition of town and country that was kind of essential to sort of economics, to manufacture and so on, became the site for the contest between the kings and the barons. And the free towns, the freedom of the towns, the freedom that existed in the towns of government, of possessing your own property, of allowing your children to marry who they want, those rights came about because of this self-interested contest of these kings and the barons for power. Well, now, things go on from there too. As these towns develop in their freedom, beyond manufacture, they start getting involved in trade, especially those ones that are on the coasts and can build ships and can sail to other places, get involved in foreign trade. They start to bring in goods that look pretty nice to those rich barons. And so those rich barons suddenly have a new use for all that wealth that they get from their big lands. They used to have to use it or else it would go to waste. They used it to support all those people who lived on those lands who then became their followers. Now they take that wealth and say, oh, I want to buy some of those fancy luxury goods that are being imported from other countries. But that means they no longer have that money to support all those people on their lands. And so, with the development of towns came the development of foreign trade, and with the development of foreign trade came the development of this luxury market, whereby barons started using their wealth to buy fancy things for themselves rather than supporting a huge community. So the number of people who were supported by the barons dropped dramatically. And those ones now that did still work there had to supply the baron with wealth by the work they did on the farms or whatever. Now, without that ongoing support of the baron, who says, "Oh, I'm going to, use my wealth to feed you and deliver justice and all the rest," and so people would now only agree to do the work. I mean, they only could agree to do the work of farming the baron's lands for him if they could make deals with the baron whereby they could basically own the land and they could basically have rights and privileges for governing their own lives. So the baron effectively stopped becoming the guy who handed out justice, and he stopped being able to demand military service from them, and so on. And so the barons, because of their pursuit of the luxury goods that were being brought to them by the development of foreign trade in those cities that grew up because of their contest with the kings, in the lands of those barons, government and individual ownership and so on started to emerge for those otherwise poor people. And so free government, both in the towns and in the country, grew up not by anybody pursuing that and trying to make it happen. They grew up because of these greedy barons and these greedy kings fighting each other. And then, once the cities grew up, these greedy merchants who were trying to find ways that they could sell products. And so out of the self-interest of all of these groups, people who had no interest in being nice to anyone else, what actually developed were the institutions of free government in Europe. There's a second area where Smith talks about the way that economics kind of works behind our back, and it's what he calls the invisible hand of economics. And he means a specific thing by that. When you do your economic work in your home area, the domestic economy actually benefits, as if by an invisible hand. That's different, from what was happening when those barons were buying luxury goods. There, the wealth of the barons was being used to make the merchants in town rich, and that was buying foreign goods. So the wealth of the barons' estates was really being shipped out. This is the sort of thing that you see in Spike Lee's film, Do the Right Thing. There's Sal's Pizzeria, it's Italian pizzeria in a black neighborhood. It's a little bit controversial because there's a guy, Sal, he likes the people he works with, people like him, he's been running that business for a long time, but what happens is, all the black people in that community come in and buy their pizza there. Sal makes a profit, but he's taking his profit home to wherever he lives in a white Italian neighborhood in New York. That's where he's spending his money, and so whatever benefits he's making from his business there are being used to develop a community somewhere else. Right, and that's the same thing with chains, McDonald's or whatever. In your neighborhood, you put money into it, but that money just gets shipped elsewhere. But so Smith's point is, when you do your work at home, the domestic economy benefits by this invisible hand. And Smith's point overall in this book is his criticism of what he calls the system of merchants, the mercantile system. He's critical of governments that, in place of supporting the healthy economic development of their society as a whole, have focused everything on subordinating the needs of the national economy to the immediate interests of merchants, of traders. And he especially wants to emphasize how, in things like the British colonies in India, bad government has resulted in allowing these nasty exploitative people like the British East India Company to go and just essentially plunder India in a way that destroys the country, rather than that very thing we were just talking about the invisible hand, rather than establishing a healthy economic system in which the business those people are involved in actually goes hand in hand with the development of the national situation.